Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here for this event. And I, as I said at the opening this morning, had been involved in some of the initial discussions when there was a vision, and there was a vision to actually provide therapeutic treatment using a trauma and attachment-based model for these children who are so vulnerable. And at that time, it was marvellous to have that chance to really talk about the implications of a lot of the science that's been going on for some time about why we should be doing this. It's an interesting issue that science sometimes points us in one direction, but actually getting that translated, getting that on the ground and getting that to inform our practice can sometimes take a bit longer. But the good news is here we are. Thinking very much about how to use our better understanding of early intervention, what that actually means, and put that into practice. So I'm going to just outline for you some of the current thinking about the implications of early trauma, mainly just to highlight some of the future directions that a great service like this might actually be able to incorporate, do some research around, do some training when we're looking at people's trauma-informed practice, and open up the discussion for us. Very clearly at the moment we have, I think, a much more complex understanding of the impact of early adversity in the broadest sense, so talking about attachment disruption, inconsistent care, emotionally disturbed care, right up to the more extremes that sadly we see where children can be abused and neglected. Of course, we have to put this into a context. Trauma and poor care of children happens in vulnerable and stressed communities. It can happen to vulnerable children, and sadly, and I'll get this in early, it can happen as a result of government policy. So we have at the moment a policy which is allowing the indefinite and arbitrary detention of babies and young children in situations such as on Christmas Island, and those children are facing deportation to situations like Nauru and Manus Island. As you can imagine, the parents finding themselves with new babies on somewhere like Christmas Island are distressed and despairing, and over the last 2 days, if you're following the media, you'll be aware that up to 10 of those women have attempted suicide. That's a result of government policy. And I think it's very much very important that as we think about those of us who are in academic or clinical practice roles, we also have a role to speak up about government policy when it's damaging and harmful, and when it's actually something that is in our area. So this is not an issue, I believe, that any of us can remain neutral on at the current time. Those of us who work in child protection and for the care of children think about all children. We think about the asylum seeker children, particularly at the moment, as some of the most vulnerable in our situation. We know, sadly, that those children who are exposed to some of these extremes of adversity are going to have potentially long-term harm to sensitive neurological and behavioural and emotional development. The association between early adversity and mental health problems is also well known. And I say this sometimes a little bit despairingly because we have actually known this for some time. And a lot of us, and many people in this room and colleagues and friends here, have also been involved in raising these issues in our various circles repeatedly. We should be doing more early intervention. We need to have more targeted and focused interventions for some of the most vulnerable. Maybe waiting until adolescence or young adulthood when a disorder might appear is a little bit late, which is a sad thing. But we do know a lot more about the developmental pathways and the risk factors for disturbance, and maybe that's where we could be targeting some more of our limited resources. We know the impact on societies and communities of early abuse and trauma. It's not just the relationship to diagnosable mental health problems, it's also a relationship to social exclusion, to poor social functioning, to relationship breakdowns, people coping or attempting to cope with the misuse of drugs and alcohol. So a whole range of social impacts of abuse and trauma also need to be highlighted. And importantly, we do know, even if we can't always implement it as much as we would like, about the sorts of early intervention approaches that might be helpful. This is one of my experimental babies, baby Tully. Now, babies, as you know, are very keen to participate in research. Volunteered, she put her hand up, and there she was. And so she's obviously a very young child, and we're thinking about someone like Tully in terms of the rapid neurological development that's going on in the first 3 years of her life. She's actually a very healthy and fortunate child in many ways, but many are not. And the damage and the implications of being traumatised during the early years is something that is very difficult to translate into adequate services and to preventive approaches, maybe because some of the damage, if you like, might not be apparent until later. If we look at mental health inpatients in a health system, from that perspective, around 70% of adult patients in the hospital system report histories of early trauma and abuse. This is obviously, regardless of diagnosis, I should say. So regardless of the type of mental health problem, the rates of early abuse and adversity are very high. We know that people who've been traumatised early are certainly at risk of ongoing trauma and what we might think of as re-victimisation. Very commonly, we're seeing patterns in people's lives where self-protection becomes difficult, and obviously then, in a transgenerational sense, the impact of early trauma on parenting capacity and the difficulties that people who've experienced abuse and trauma might have in seeing themselves as an attachment figure, as a protective person, and the conflicts and problems that can present with. So again, an ideal opportunity for true early intervention might be working in the antenatal period. If we're fortunate to see prospective parents at that point who are more likely to have parenting difficulties or child protection difficulties, they are a group to work with, and a particularly important group who are open to psychological support and work in many cases. Many people, despite the fact that they've had histories of early trauma and neglect, are absolutely focused on trying to get it right with their child. And I think we need to move away from a rather pejorative stance that many services have taken, where we tend to put people with histories of abuse and trauma in the too hard bucket and assume that they're going to fail, when in fact many of the young women that I work with who have very troubled histories are absolutely focused on getting it right and work very effectively with a service, if the service is focused on their needs and actually relates to them, which is maybe a shift when we think about traditional early parenting and mental health services. If we work with young people, we're obviously in the mental health system seeing many distressed young people who might be making disclosures of trauma and abuse who've not been able to do that before. And there is considerable concern, obviously, about safety during that process of disclosure. And also, when we're thinking young people, social media, we think about the contagious effect of distress that can easily and rapidly go through a group of young people. In my health area in Victoria, we've been responding to a tragic situation of what's defined as a suicide cluster. We've lost 15 young people over a 12-month period. This is despairing, and we need to look in a very broad way to try and understand the complex sort of mix of factors that contribute to that, one of which, and we know a lot about the background of these young people, is early trauma and abuse. And great difficulties in using other people as secure bases in attachment theory terms, or finding a place of safety. And that sort of level of alienation and despair, compounded with drug and alcohol abuse, can contribute to these terrible and tragic situations. What we do know then is that early trauma sets up what we might call neurovulnerability. In other words, thinking about a nervous system and a response system, a brain system that's vulnerable to later stress and trauma. So that trauma is not going to, in a simple way, cause a particular problem, but it's associated with risk, increased risk for the entire range of mental health problems and, importantly, very poor psychosocial outcome. The other controversial issue, I guess, is important to talk about is the use of language and the sorts of language and diagnoses, particularly in the mental health system, that we use to talk about trauma, which, I have a particular view that we don't do that well at all, that we tend to fall back on diagnoses when that's probably not a very appropriate thing to do, that if something's related to trauma and traumatic experience, we should call it that. And many people that I work with have a diagnosis of so-called borderline personality disorder. That might mean something in terms of a description, if you like, of some of the difficulties that those people face. But it has become, and this is the problem, it's become a pejorative label to describe people that we find difficult. We as in the system, we as in the clinicians or the responders. And so we often use that term in a pejorative or negative sense. Sadly, we sometimes use it, of course, about our colleagues. So look, our colleague down the hallway is a very difficult person to get on with. They must be personality disordered. I think we have to be very careful about using these sorts of terms. But on the other hand, and I'm aware that there is an argument, I'm not meaning to be dismissive of it, amongst some consumers of health services who are very traumatised people, that sometimes having a name or a description of what's going on for them is helpful. So I have had some people say to me that they welcome a diagnostic label. I think there are different views on this, but it's all about how we use something to validate people's experience. Whatever we call this field that we work in, it is essential that we maintain a commitment to people's human rights and treat people with dignity, and that we have the capacity to validate their experience of whatever trauma they've experienced. And also to, I think, acknowledge that the mental health system on the whole has not done well with trauma or child abuse. And in child mental health circles where I am some of the time, there is still a discussion going on, and many in this audience will have had this discussion for many years, that child protection and child abuse and treatment of child trauma is not core business for child and adolescent mental health services. This is very difficult, and it's been, at least 20 years that we've had that discussion. So we do need to shift some of this thinking. So we think in a simple way about the impact of high levels of stress early on and how that can affect the developing nervous system and neurodevelopment overall. So maltreatment and abuse of children is very much a non-specific risk factor. And if you look at some of the more recent studies, and I can provide you these if you're interested in reading them, but there's been some very large-scale studies that have tried to work out statistically how much of the burden of adult-type mental health problems can be associated with early adversity. It's a complex thing to do methodologically, but important that we try and look at that. And roughly, if you believe their statistics, we can look at least a third of adult-type onset mental health problems having clear association with severe early adversity and the impact that that's had on neurodevelopment. Now, that's actually hugely significant. That's been found in a couple of studies to date. What that says in practice, if that's the case, then surely we should be putting more effort into true early intervention. And absolutely looking at preventive strategies that can intervene in the complex result of early trauma. Unfortunately, that's not easy to do and hasn't really been fully operationalised in terms of services, but there's certainly moves to do that. The DSM-5, for those of you who read the DSM every night, and it's on the bedside table, have a look at 5 and the latest version. And what you might find if you flick through it is a real lack of focus on child developmental issues, less than in DSM-4, if that's possible. And there was a proposal to have a new disorder. I'm not particularly in favour of new disorders, but this was a good one because this was going to look at trauma-related developmental disorder. In other words, a disorder that actually spoke about the reality of the impact of early abuse and trauma on the broad range of development. DSM is a highly political document, and that didn't get up, which is, I think, really disappointing. So we're left with very limited ways of describing what we see every day if we work in trauma services with children. The impact on personality development, children struggling to control their feelings, children struggling with their interpersonal functioning, children highly anxious about who is going to be there for them, who they can trust. Some of the core issues that we deal with in therapeutic intervention with children. So I think that's something we need to keep lobbying for. The current range of diagnoses that we have are not particularly helpful in describing the complexities of trauma and the way it impacts child development. Attachment disorders are certainly a useful notion, but even then the DSM doesn't talk very much about them. So I think we have a problem in terms of conceptualising these sorts of problems. So the cost is huge, and I'm speaking to the converted, so I won't label this, but obviously we're looking at the burden of mental health problems and substance abuse, other social problems. And we're looking, the area that I mainly work in is looking at the transgenerational issues. What happens when traumatised children attempt to become parents themselves? What happens, what are the conflicts and issues for them? How can we better intervene? So to really looking at the prevention of what we know is a very clear association between someone who's been abused having difficulties in their own parenting. So these are day-to-day things that we come up against. The easiest way of thinking about what trauma does in a neurodevelopmental way is to think about the way in which traumatic experiences and interactions, so the quality of care, quality of emotional interactions, the way that those things are directly inscribed into the fabric of the developing brain. So the brain, as it's growing in the early years, develops around these traumatic experiences. The brain then remembers trauma. Trauma is literally in the pathways and functions of the brain, which helps us understand some of the responses of people who in adult life have experienced early trauma, who might remain, if you like, oriented around threat and danger. Makes good sense. If you're an abused child growing up in a dangerous and threatening environment, to be on the lookout for danger, not to trust people, to act first and ask questions later, and a whole lot of the difficulties that we see presenting for children. But essentially it's about a survival mode, both neurologically and emotionally and psychologically. We then describe in a limited way those things as symptoms. So the person who is not trusting others, who reacts very strongly to things that remind them of early trauma, is sometimes described as having a PTSD or a borderline sort of disorder. Actually, it's much easier to think about that in terms of a traumatic response, the way in which trauma itself shapes evolving attachment relationships and fundamentally the capacity to relate to others. And many of the adult survivors of abuse that we speak to describe that as one of the most damaging impacts, if you like, of not knowing how to be with others, of not knowing who's safe to be with, and feeling at risk of finding themselves re-victimised or in situations of ongoing danger. So these are people who essentially have had been programmed, if you like, in survival mode, very necessary at the time, not particularly adaptive for adult functioning. But the trauma that they've experienced has essentially shaped a trauma response system and the way they manage strong feelings and particularly states of anxiety and negative feeling. So the term early intervention, and I've used it already several times, has become, for various reasons, a highly contested term in our sort of area. Some people talk about early in life, as in, and I tend to use it in that way, about early intervention in those critical years of early brain development. Some people speak about early in the course of disorder, or if they're fortunate, pre-disorder. Some people speak about intervening early in the onset of when someone's having an episode of mental disorder. The implications of all of this, though, sounds rather semantic, but the implications are important because there's been very much in terms of this funding and resourcing, particularly of mental health services, a lot of rhetoric around funding early intervention, by which they mean, in practice, funding services for adolescents and young adults who certainly need services, that's really not the question, but funding that and calling that early intervention at the expense of intervention earlier in the lifespan when we might actually be able to do prevention and intervene in developmental pathways. So I'm being a little bit provocative here, but when we think about some of the discussions that go on about we must do early intervention, we must put the money there, we're preventing mental disorder, they're actually not. Many of the youth mental health services and that movement are very much treating, sadly, young people who already have mental disorder, whereas some of us are much more interested in preventing the development of mental disorder to that extent. There's been very effective Lobbying, of course, going on. This is a highly politicised context, and some people have done exceptionally well in putting their case, and all the best to them. But it means that the rest of us who are seeing some of the very early impacts, particularly of child abuse and trauma, maybe need to get better at doing that sort of advocacy and that lobbying, but that's very difficult. How do we maintain a developmental approach in our work? And I think one of the most important things we can do is to talk about the developmental implications of what we see early on. It's actually quite hard to define how trauma in the very young. Lenore Ter, who many of you will be familiar with, was a trauma researcher who started writing about this in the 80s in a very important way. She talked about trauma as those events that overwhelm people's capacity to cope and their defensive operations. So if you're a 2-month-old baby on Christmas Island with a mother who's depressed and despairing, and you're living in a harsh environment with people around you who are despairing, that's trauma. How we understand that is obviously needs to be based on our developmental models of what a child of that age can do. If you're a 2-month baby in a dreadful situation, there's not actually terribly much you can do to protect yourself. What we see in practice, as we're seeing at the moment, are babies who are failing to thrive, so they're not growing, babies who are poorly interactive. A little baby I see at the moment who's an asylum seeker baby, he can't maintain any eye contact with anyone. He's 7 months of age and he won't look at anyone. He's the saddest baby that, as one of my staff said, the saddest baby I've ever seen is baby Muhammad. I mean, these are tragic. So he's a young child, there's not much he can do. Older children, of course, will use different approaches to try and protect themselves. Many of us are familiar in our work with children who try and get their attachment needs met anywhere. The socially indiscriminate child, the child with what some used to be called social promiscuity, I don't think that's a very nice term, but meaning that the child goes to anyone. And a lot of us have had those experiences of meeting a child for the first time, and they say, how many children have you got at home? Which really means, can I come home with you? Is there room for someone else? And we see many examples of children who indicate and signal need. And what's important, of course, is that we respond to that. We respond to that as a service, we respond to that as clinicians, but we recognise it for what it is. Children have tremendous resilience and will keep signalling need even in the face of very poor and depriving environments. So what Lenore Ter pointed out, that it's easy to be overwhelmed, but a developmental understanding of that means that we need to understand what people can do at different ages to protect themselves and the implications of that. So when we look at the so-called adult survivor with so-called borderline personality disorder, some of the features that those people can struggle with are really sometimes the hanging around of mechanisms that they used previously when they were in situations of danger, which might be maladaptive in the present sense, but we need to understand where they come from and the strong desire to self-protect and how that works. So the field of so-called developmental traumatology, it's a nice sounding field, has developed very rapidly to the extent now that there's very important work looking at the role of the impact of trauma on genetic expression, for example. So we're going from epigenetics to better understanding the impact of toxic stress and stress-related hormones on brain development and functioning. We've now got to the stage of trying to understand some adult mental health diagnoses in a trauma-related framework, and we understand more about developmental risk periods. So those periods when the brain and nervous system are organising and growing very rapidly are great opportunities for healthy development, but they're also risk periods. So that would include the rapid growth that goes on in the first 4 years of life. It would also include adolescent development and young adulthood development and the things that are going on in the brain at that point, which many of you will be familiar with. I think that gives us a much better way of thinking about what we call symptoms and maybe moving from that sort of language to understanding some of these issues that people present with as adaptations and the way in which people have literally, in terms of their brain and emotional functioning, needed to operate in terms of surviving dangerous dangerous environments. So that I've said the clear association of early adversity in the broadest sense with adult mental health disorders, and that we now need to think about trauma-related mental disorder. Transgenerational issues are always going to be a core part of our work in child protection contexts. And surprisingly, and very surprising to me, maybe not to others, we have very limited research looking at some of the better ways of intervening and engaging with traumatised parents. The so-called parent with borderline personality disorder, having done a recent review of the literature, where there will be an Oxford University Press putting out a textbook which will be great on parenting and mental disorder sometime early next year. But there are a handful of good outcome studies looking at interventions for these sorts of parents. There are a handful of papers looking at even defining the population and what the issues are, which is very surprising given that's what we see so often in our work. Wouldn't be surprising if it was a rare event, but it is probably the most common thing that we see and one of the most important to address. So the parents that we work with, people with their own unresolved traumatic attachment issues and their histories of maltreatment and neglect and the range of issues that sets up for them when they want to parent effectively. Anxiety is obviously going to be common. How can I parent my child when no one cared for me? Sometimes we see parents who are almost avoidant. The whole situation is so hard. So I would see some young women who find it very hard to be with their babies. As one young woman described to me recently, I don't want to get too close to my child because something bad could happen. She couldn't tell me what, but she had a broad anxiety that things would go wrong. And it might be that her baby wouldn't like her, but it also might be something about I could descend into and recreate with my own child what happened to me. And that phenomenon of recapitulation or reenactment of trauma from the past of the parent in the relationship with their child is probably one of the most common things that we see, and a very distressing experience, obviously, for parents. In child protection circles, we're obviously very familiar with the concept of repetition, how powerful that is. And look, I think it's sort of black humour, isn't it? But many of us can think back to some of the very tragic situations where people have repeated many times what happened to them with a child. And, we might see it happening in a terrible, repetitive way, this cycle of abuse, and get quite overwhelmed by that. But these are obviously all opportunities for us to put in place interventions, but they're understudied. So if we think about the young, the very young, we see traumatised infants and young children who've experienced a range of different interactions with carers. From one extreme, obviously we see direct and indirect maltreatment and abuse, and we try and understand the developmental impact of that. But we also, in a more subtle way, see parents who are struggling in a day-to-day basis with providing consistent and available care. Parents who find it hard to see themselves as an attachment figure, if you like, or as a secure base. And sometimes these are very important things to assess, obviously, in our evaluations. We're trying to understand what factors contribute to that ability to be there for the child, to think about the child, to be able to prioritise the needs of the child, and importantly for us, how does that break down and what factors contribute to that? There can be individual factors, clearly, but there are often social and community and cultural issues that contribute to high-risk communities where there's a breakdown of traditionally supportive caregiving and caretaking functions. So if I'm working, for example, with the refugee population, then there's no way to look at child protection in those populations in isolation from their experiences of loss and grief and loss of home, loss of culture, and the impact that's had on traditionally supportive and appropriate ways of managing children. But sometimes in our area that gets missed because of a focus on risk to children. So we have to get that balance right. Clearly we look at risk to children and look at intervention, but we need to understand context and how that comes about. But these sorts of traumatic experiences early on, whilst I've stressed neurodevelopment, are also going to affect psychological development. That child who's growing up in a dangerous and threatening environment where no one can understand and validate his or her experiences are going to have major difficulties in their own emotional development. So the concept of what's sometimes called reflective functioning, or the ability to think of and understand ourselves and other people in terms of mental states, feelings, wishes, beliefs, and to understand and regulate our emotions are some of the core aspects of deficit, if you like to use that word, or difficulty that we see in people who've experienced major abusive early years. The other bit of terminology that's often used, because we don't have many better ways of thinking about it, is attachment disorganisation. So many of the children that we see are going to have, as I said, those difficulties in understanding their internal states and putting words around them. They're going to have core difficulties in understanding that question that we all need to ask: who is there for me? I think we heard, in the welcome, which was very powerful and moving. Children need to know that they're loved. They need to know who's there for them. Communities that are functioning and healthy offer that to all children. But children who've grown up in the environments that we're thinking about have fundamental and deep-seated anxiety about that basic question, the availability of the attachment figure. What we see behaviourally, which then gets diagnosed if they end up in a system, are often expressions of anxiety about that, ways that children are desperately trying to get their attachment needs met, and the strategies that they can try and use to signal their needs and to hopefully get some response. But that's very difficult if they don't have the words to say it, the emotional vocabulary that's needed to engage with others and to regulate their own states. So they're going to have some of the core problems that we see in this reflective functioning, in empathy or understanding others. And these are the things that really shape and disrupt ongoing functioning in a psychological and social way. The abused child grows up with contradictory and confused ideas about who they are and the availability of adults. So one model that they might have very much says, I'm a good child and I really want to hang on to the idea that I've had a loving family. So if you directly work with children, you can ask an abused child to draw a family portrait, and you'll often get that idealised one initially. The family all lined up in front of the beautiful house. It looks like a ski chalet. The sun's shining, the rainbows in the sky. Everyone's smiling. The mum, the dad, whatever family members are there, the pet dog and the pet cat, and the child. Now, these are very tragic when we think about the reality of some of these children's lives. But that's really showing us that that child has that capacity to try and maintain an idealised notion of themselves. I'm a good child with a loving family. Mentally, alongside that, there's another model which sadly might be more reality-based, which they are trying not to let intrude on their mental functioning, but the model that says, I am a bad child. I'm complicit in my own maltreatment. I have done something to provoke my parents. I'm guilty. And this is often, if we think developmentally, forming the kernel, if you like, around which that child's sense of self develops. I'm a bad and unworthy child and I can't trust anyone. Now, what children try and do, of course, and we can all understand this, is to keep those very separate and to maintain a more idealising picture, but also not to think about the reality of the maltreatment. This is a very important clinical point for those of you who do clinical work, that abused children are frequently putting a huge amount of psychological energy into not thinking about what is going on in the mind of the parent, whether it was recent, whether it was in the past. And that's a great struggle for all survivors of abuse and maltreatment, to come to some sort of understanding of why. Why did it happen? Within an attachment theory framework, we often work with those sorts of concepts to help people build up some level of understanding that firstly, it wasn't their fault. I think that's that can be very difficult, but also that it can be thought about. It's not too. It might seem incredibly overwhelming at times, but it needs to be approached in a gradual way, but thought about. That it can be understood. That there might be reasons. Now, ultimately, of course, we might not know all the reasons why the abuse happened for this particular child, but the child survivor needs a psychological model for understanding that. Not to say that they forget it or it's a simplistic thing about, I forgive everyone who was bad to me. It's not that. It's more, I can live with the reality of it, or what happened to me, and I can understand it on some level. I might not ever like it. That makes something bearable and livable. And I think it's important that when we think about our approaches, that we think about, well, how do we operationalise some of these issues, and what do we aim at? How do we set the standard, if you like? And we're not sometimes talking to people about cure in a simple way. We're not saying we can help you forget all the badness that happened to you. And maybe it's important that people have some connection with that. And that makes it much less likely, of course, that they're going to repeat that. We have to help people have a greater degree of understanding or reflective functioning around abusive experiences, but in a way that enables them to be self-protective, so they can enter into healthy relationships. And a centre like this, if we look at the model, has very much stressed that idea of building up the capacity for safety in relationships and productive relationships. So this notion of attachment disorganisation, the way in which trauma early on, usually at the hands, of course, of attachment figures, disrupts and is an attack on attachment itself, is an important concept. Trauma also disrupts systems of meaning and thinking. That's also something that should... Oh, that was lucky. The gods are speaking to me. That should also speak to our ways of working with people. So we're moving, if you like, from a system or an approach where we've maybe focused overly on getting people to repeat the details of trauma and abuse, when maybe that's not the focus. The focus needs maybe to be more on the understanding, the capacity to think, and the ability to move forward with something rather than get stuck with the notion of, I've been traumatised, I will always be a trauma survivor as my only defining characteristic. Now that's controversial, and people might have different views about that, but we certainly want people who can acknowledge the reality of what's happened to them to contribute in whatever way they wish to future activities which are about supporting others or preventing abuse, but who recognise that they want, to a certain extent, to be free of some of that history and not labelled entirely by it. Very difficult balance to get right, and that's a lot of discussion going on about that in the trauma survivor network, as it should. So we know a lot, obviously, and you'll be familiar with this, about maltreating parents, but the issue I wanted to stress was the transgenerational issues, the history of abuse and trauma in themselves, obviously, but how that sets up expectations about who the child is. So a very important focus of this work is to help that parent acknowledge, obviously, that they are going to potentially have some issues that need support around their own history, but to help them free up the child, if you like. Parents who are needy and emotionally deprived will often see the child as the one who's going to make up for all their own losses and early emotional deprivation. So the child becomes, in the mind of the parent, the one who's going to be able to be their friend, support them, the perfect relationship that's going to make up for all the difficulties that they've had with other relationships. Now, that's obviously well-intentioned, if you like, but it puts in an enormous pressure on the child, and ultimately the child can't be that for the parent. So those dynamics of role reversal, neediness, are a level on which, if we're doing therapeutic interventions, we can actually work. The other point, and I'm aware of the time, I'll wrap up with this, but we need to think better about the way in which, and understand better the way in which children present, and think about our language. And again, this is an issue for those of us who get to make diagnoses, but maybe moving away from some of the simplistic approaches to diagnosis of child disorders and trying to understand better within a trauma framework what that actually, what the symptoms so-called actually mean. So ADHD is probably a very good example of a diagnosis that's used, in my view, excessively to describe a whole range of different things. The way in which children with that so-called disorder present might well be quite valid. I'm not disputing that. What it misses is the notion of developmental pathways and factors contributing to that sort of behavioural outcome. So when a child from a dysfunctional family goes to see clinician X and in 10 minutes has a diagnosis of ADHD, I personally think that's problematic because it's decontextualised. There's a whole lot of the other work that we could be doing about parenting practices, about abuse and maltreatment, the aftermath of trauma gets missed. So it's an issue maybe of premature diagnosis or using diagnoses simplistically. And it's a wishful activity because people maybe have a deep-seated belief or a wish that if we just get the diagnosis right, we can get the treatment right. Sadly, we haven't really done that over many years of ADHD. That's just one example. Of course, there are many, and things go in and out of fashion, if you like. We've currently got epidemics of autism spectrum disorders. Must be something in the water is causing this, it's everywhere, and a whole range of other conditions. I think we just have to be a little bit cautious and ask, again, the simple questions, why? And what factors have contributed to this in this child? So with traumatised children, of course, we can see a range of symptoms. Some of them are listed here. We can see the way, though, in which that can affect the way in which trauma affects the child's capacity to relate to others, reenactment with peers, the things that are obviously deeply troubling about children, and the blows that trauma has meted for that child's self-concept, self-representation, as I mentioned before, the child who feels guilty or complicit. We know that children process and recall these, regardless of age, traumatic events. They'll then reenact that in play, in behaviour. They can remain highly anxious and aroused. And we can, if we have the eyes to see it, recognise some of the ongoing impacts of trauma. What we see longitudinally, and these are the issues we deal with in therapeutic ways, are ways in which children adapt or attempt to adapt to stress according to their developmental stage, so what they can do at the time. But that chronic stress, the abused child essentially in a state of chronic, unresolvable anxiety, that's going to have major developmental impacts on development and neurobiological functioning. And if we get those basic principles, and they are clear principles, and trying to get them across in that way, then that should inform our approach to the child, our diagnostic approach. If we think a child has been traumatised and has some of these features, we can still use the PTSD label if we need to use a label for various purposes of documentation and health system functioning. But we can formulate, we can write down. I think it's very important that we note the story of the individual child in their individual context, in their community, and what factors might have contributed to it. We can then move away from, and this is the final point I make, we can move away from some of the more reductionist diagnoses that don't help any of us necessarily understand. And we can consider maybe some of the broader issues of attachment disorders, of what we call attachment disorders, talking about PTSD, understanding disruptive behaviours in the context of what the child is trying to communicate to us. Why is a child who's been abused drawn to abusive interactions? Why do they relate in that way? What internal models do they have of how relationships work? So bringing that back to an attachment framework and looking for stress. And from my perspective, I think we can look at very early acute stress responses. We need our systemic response and our clinical response to become more efficient at looking at some of the issues for the very young. If we're going to be serious about this whole idea of prevention, we think about the vulnerability of children during these rapid periods of neurodevelopment, and that's where we should be targeting some of our resources. Thank you very much.